Hey everybody, this is Perch. One of the questions I get asked a lot is whatever happened to Chris Claremont on the X-Men? Why did he leave the X-Men? He had a very long, kind of celebrated run. I think he was Marvel's writer golden child, although Marvel in that era didn't necessarily think about it in the same way they do today. He was definitely one of kind of their big guys, but writers were not celebrated like they are now. At least they're not this omnipresent force that we see today. In most cases, the artist was probably more the front billing, and that may play in a little bit. But the interesting thing about Claremont and the X-Men is that the story of what kind of went down has changed and morphed and evolved over time. And a lot of people have come in and said, here's the real story. And Claremont has given many interviews where he talks, little bits, but you kind of have to piece all the parts together. And I think the key here is nothing is super dramatic, but there are a few pieces there. So where this all begins, I think, for Claremont is that, most stories center around one individual being probably the core driving reason. And that was the X Titles group editor, Bob Harras. Now, Bob Harras, of course, went on to take a more senior position at Marvel, and then he was fired, and then he went to Wildstorm and ultimately DC, and he was recently part of the layoffs there. But how did Bob Harras kind of play into all this? Well, again, we're reading a little bit between the lines of a lot of interviews and things that have taken place, but one of the things that Claremont has kind of consistently talked up or said was positive for him was Ann Nocenti and her reign as the editor and how wonderful she was. And there's often this kind of over the top, well, not over the top, there's a lot of praise that goes to Nocenti's direction that then abruptly stops when you get to Harris. So to kind of get into a little bit of what was going on maybe with Marvel and the titles and what ultimately led to Claremont's departure is to take a look at what was going on with Marvel at the time. And this is there was this huge kind of late 80s, but definitely like 1990, 1991, suddenly a lot of attention and a lot of focus from the customers was toward the artists. And in particular, people like Rob Liefeld and Jim Lee, Todd McFarlane, Mark Silvestri, Walsh Pataccio. They were the big names. They were the people that were bringing the titles, and Marvel was happily riding that wave. And there started to be this behavior within Marvel of you let those artists do whatever they want. You basically, you don't want to ruffle any feathers. They are cash cow at the moment, which is not altogether wrong. In fact, there's a lot of truth to that. Those titles were selling really, really well, and it was on the backs of the hard work of those artists that was going on there. And I mean, in particular, Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee, and Rob Liefeld were huge heavyweights in this business. And of course, Jim Lee was over there on X-Men along with Weiss Portacio, and they were basically doing the two books. So what was starting to happen with them is that they and keep in mind the other piece is money. Those artists are their work is rapidly getting licensed to T-shirts and to posters and everything else. So there's not just the money being gained from the comics. There's all this extra money that was going on. These artists were also somewhat or had become somewhat late. So here's where you have kind of two differing points of view. On one hand, you get the point of view of, hey, they were creating kind of really strong, masterful work, and Marvel was trying to churn out more and more, so of course they're going to be late. It makes sense that they would be late. On the other hand, this was probably, or this not probably, it was a difference in how Claremont used to work, where he was used to working with, I would say, a couple kind of heavyweights like John Byrne and Dave Cockrum, John Romita Jr. to some extent, who were very, very fast. So going from like a John Byrne type personality of, and Claremont and Byrne had certainly plenty of problems of their own, but going from that kind of speed over to, say, a Jim Lee or Portacio, that's where it would be a major change. I think things would take twice as long. And again, that's not really a knock against anybody. It was just a different style and how it was all going. So as the artists kind of, I mean, it was very apparent to them they were leading the charge. Marvel's promoting them. there was these requests. The artists started to want more power. You had McFarlane wanting to do his own book. You had Jim Lee make the request to have more input in the plot because he wanted to do certain pieces. And this is the point in the story where you hear a lot of different opinions and a lot of different ideas over kind of who's right and who's wrong and what all was asked for or wasn't asked for. What we do know is more was asked for. And Claremont was basically seemed happy to work with Jim Lee. And here's where I want to throw in this. A lot of people have speculated or done videos or done posts saying that there was a deep rift that grew between Jim Lee and Claremont, and Claremont hated him and all the rest. But that doesn't wash. And I say that because in subsequent interviews and in through the years, Claremont's always been very gracious, I would say, to Jim Lee. He's always complimented him. And Jim Lee and Claremont worked together on a Wildstorm book for a period of time. And why in the world would Claremont go and do work with Jim Lee, on his own accord down the road if there's this deep animosity? So I don't believe that holds up at all. A lot of people have made a lot of noise about that and kind of played up the drama there, but it doesn't wash. It just doesn't make any sense. But what does fit is the Harras connection. So as Claremont would at times, and we've heard this from interviews too, he'd receive pages and he didn't know what was going on. And this was a definite change from how it had worked through his career. And Claremont, who tended to be a very, I would say, intricate writer who liked to kind of style things a certain way and have a certain pace and he just liked his comics to be a certain way, and he'd been successful for that way for all that time. He was unhappy, and so Claremont complained, and this is on the record. He complained to Harras about the tardiness of both Lee and others, and that they needed to do something to fix the problem. Now, from what all accounts are, it wasn't, hey, you need to get Jim Lee off the book. It was that we need to do things differently. We need to maybe have a more steady artist on one of the books, or just basically change that up. And here's where the rub seems to occur. It's at least stated that Claremont was made a bunch of promises. We'll fix this problem for sure. We will do things. But instead, kind of the opposite happened. Nothing really changed. Harras did give Lee complete veto power over new plot lines. But what's weird is you talk to Jim Lee later, and Jim Lee said he never asked for that in the first place. So it really felt like a lot of dickery on the part of Harras toward Claremont, and it just drove him further and further out. And I think it definitely made Claremont feel he was being disrespected on a title he'd been on for 20 odd years or so. And Harras reportedly stopped answering mail and just kind of stopped talking to him. And so Chris Claremont took himself out. He left the X titles early on in the new X-Men relaunch. They brought in John Byrne, who lasted even less time. just kind of came, decided nope, and left. And then, of course, the punchline to all this is that it was, and by the way, there's a story there kind of relating to Byrne, and that Byrne came in, saw this complete mess going on, complained about style and complained about the lateness of the artists, and was basically told by Harras, oh yeah, we'll get right on that. And then they never sent Byrne any more pages at that point. They just kind of ghosted him. And so just really kind of douchey behavior. And then, of course, as I said, the punchline to all this is that about a year later or less, the Image artists, formed Image, and they all bailed. So all of the bending over backwards that Harras did to kind of keep these guys happy didn't work. And if you've listened to Rob Liefeld's podcast and kind of other interviews at the time, the interesting piece, and why this gets to be a slightly complicated, nuanced story, is that it sounds like the Image artists weren't necessarily asking for or particularly wanted some of the things that Harras was doing for them. And if anything, that seemed to, just make them aware that they were working in a corporate stooge kind of system where things could turn against them at any moment too. So they leave, and it just craters a lot of what was going on with the X-Tiles. You ran off a hugely successful writer. It's been argued, and I don't know if this is completely fair, but it's been argued that the X-Men books never really have been the same after that. And Claremont did come back and do a little bit more down the road, but it was never the same. And in many cases, it was just it was very goofy. Um, so I mean, I would say, from my own standpoint, here's where it's like, um, this is my view, not doesn't need to be anybody else's. I think Marvel did Claremont pretty dirty, and I think Harris in particular did Claremont pretty dirty. I think it shows a real lack of leadership, because the editor in this case is meant to be kind of a leader who's supposed to pull this together, who's supposed to resolve conflicts, who's supposed to figure out a path for how these books get out and get done. And many cases Harris, and I think this has become kind of a cultural standard at Marvel, just kind of walked away from that responsibility. And I think you see the continued evidence of some of that stuff here. And now Harris would go over to DC, and a lot of similar complaints, started to arise over there as well. The biggest one being, you complain about something and you're told, oh yeah, I'll get right on that. Yeah, this is important. And then nothing. Your complaint, your concern goes into the wastebasket. And that's of course no way to be a manager either. But anyway, in short, that's the brief history of what went on with Claremont and the X titles, and where I think a lot of people pin the blame at times on Jim Lee or the artists, where I think the real responsibility from everything I've read and seen and heard and talked to is Bob Harras. But anyway, there you go. So hopefully that answers your question, and thanks for asking it. And if you have any more, just leave a comment below. Like, subscribe, click the bell for notifications, and most importantly, thanks for listening.